Hello, loyal fans. Welcome to my bedroom. This is technically the University of Toronto for the day, with the day being tomorrow, because this is a presentation that I was supposed to give at the University of Toronto. About a 15-minute presentation for the composing class of Andrew Downing, fellow Andrew, who is probably watching this, and some other students. It's supposed to be a 15-minute presentation about a subject of our choice, about composing. Some kind of composer or some kind of idea. It could be like string quartet writing, it could be Japanese music, as someone picked. I picked Eddie Sauter, who's a composer arranger. I'll get into him in a second. And then so study it and then write a piece afterwards that's inspired by it. Could be exactly like it, could be anything, doesn't necessarily need to sound like it. I'm trying to make mine sound like it. So I picked Eddie Sauter for this. Eddie Sauter is a composer, arranger, but also trumpet player. He played with, I think initially Charlie Barnett and then Red Norvo in 1937. You might know him for the album with Stan Getz, 1961, something like that, called Focus, where Stan is playing with a string quartet. I absolutely love that album, but that's not the first I ever heard of Eddie Sauter. He kind of made his claim to fame with Benny Goodman, but also with the Sauter Bill Finnegan Orchestra in 51 to 59, 52 to 59, something like that. He's a very impressive arranger, big band arranger. He ended up going full-time instead of playing trumpet, I don't know, about 38 with Red Norvo. A trumpet player friend in Benny Goodman's orchestra at the time kind of got him like his first opportunity with Benny to arrange something in 1939. And then he kind of stuck around, or at least did a bunch of stuff with Benny. He also did a couple with Artie Shaw. If you ever heard Artie Shaw's Summertime, the recording where it sounds like there's Artie Shaw is playing with an echo effect, even though it's 1945. The score is actually Artie Shaw's playing with one of the other saxophone players, who must have had a thrill trying to sound like Artie Shaw playing Eddie Sauter line. But anyways, he's one of the most impressive jazz arrangers of the big band era. And you probably never heard his name. He's the only other arranger I would put up there with Duke Ellington. And yeah, he did a bunch of different things, but my favorite stuff is with Benny Goodman. It's not necessarily my favorite Benny Goodman band, but this was a really interesting part in 1939 to 1941, where at different points you still have most of Benny's best players, kind of, before he starts firing everyone every second rehearsal, but also Charlie Christian. And especially Cootie Williams, who he stole from Duke Ellington and created quite a fuss about. And Benny was just coming back from a surgery, or the slip disc thing. So he ended up having a really good sextet with those musicians, and Georgie Auld and a bunch of others, including Fletcher on piano at some different points. Yeah, so he had so much to prove. And the biggest thing I should get into for what Benny's perspective was, because I'm going off of something I love and I might as well talk a little bit about it. So Benny Goodman's like the biggest name in 1937, 1938. It's a really hard swinging band with Gene Krupa and Harry James and Ziggy Elman, blah, blah, blah. Gene Krupa leaves in 1938, March or April, something like that, where they have a big fuss on stage, start yelling at each other. It was a yelling competition about how loud Gene Krupa plays. Then Gene leaves the band and forms his own band. And after that, Benny's trying to hire different drummers. Buddy Rich could have been an option, and Buddy was like, Idol was Gene Krupa, and it would have ended up keeping Benny's band kind of the way things were. Benny didn't want that. He wanted a different band. It was a more dynamic band, more interesting in different ways. And then a year later, when he hires, I forget who the first drummer was. Technically Lionel Hampton, I think he was the first one, but he didn't do a great job. He ends up finding Eddie Sauter, who's this really good arranger, although Benny doesn't really like him at the time, which is interesting. He kind of likes some of the arrangements, but Benny, his entire life is all about Fletcher Henderson's arrangements. That's the biggest thing, and I'll get into the differences in a sec. But yeah, Eddie does a bunch of interesting things with very interesting ways that you don't expect. Okay. So, to realize what he's coming into and the whole reason why any of this is interesting in the first place, big band arranging started kind of with with Duke Ellington, but it also definitely started with Fletcher Henderson, who's the name that not as many people know, and they really should, because he is the standard of big band arranging. I don't care how much you like Duke Ellington, but Duke Ellington writes for the musicians, and Fletcher Henderson has a very specific construction on his charts. So I went down to New Haven to the Yale, University of Yale Library for their reserve collection, which has like hundreds, if not thousands, of Benny Goodman's material. Basically, Benny, in 1986, donated everything he had to the University of Yale. The New York Public Library got a few things, and I also checked them out for 6 hours or something the day before going down to New Haven for a couple of days. I took like 1,200 photos, something like that, of all the charts I could find from 18 boxes that I specifically reserved, which isn't everything by a long shot, but it's definitely some of my favorite material. I couldn't get all of my favorite material, but I tried to get as much as I could. So I checked out some specific things. I checked out a lot of Fletcher Henderson stuff as well. I'm not specifically going into Fletcher, but in order to understand Eddie Sauter, you might want to understand what Fletcher Henderson is. So I'm assuming at this point that you have some knowledge of how we're taught big band arranging in school, and to go to explain that as simply as I can. It's kind of like initially the Count Basie thing and 50s onward, I guess, because Count Basie, like, even though we think of Count Basie writing, Count Basie wasn't that in the mid-30s. It was even simpler than that. It was just riff-based writing with, I guess, Lester originally. And that was cool and that was infectious, but it wasn't necessarily the standard. Anyways, the standard, so you probably have 4 trombones, you probably have 4 or 5 trumpets, and you probably have 5 saxophones, and then a bunch of rhythm section that doesn't really matter. They do, but they don't. Let's ignore them for a second in terms of arranging. So trombones, you have 4 parts. One is going to be the lead line, could be the melody, whatever note you pick. Then the 2 of these 3 are going to be the 3rd and the 7th of the chord. Preferably 3rd and 7th, or 7th and 3rd. And then your 3rd, or your extra one, could be a color note. Technically, if the melody is the 3rd or 7th, you're not going to repeat them in the bottom. That's how your trombones work. Problem is, Fletcher Henderson, in all these bands and all this music that I like, there's only 2 trombones. So what are you going to do with them? I looked into as much as I could. I'll probably attach like a couple playing samples, or not playing samples, but PDFs of what I can for research purposes show you, because I'm technically not allowed to show or hand out or perform these things, but for research. So the interesting thing about Fletcher stuff is basically every time he had a really strong chord going from one to the next, out of the 2 trombones, the bottom note is going to be the root, and then the top one's going to be the 7th. He'll also write them pretty high, but I'll get into that in a sec. That's the trombones. Then there's 3 trumpets. In this music, how you're taught for trumpets is usually write them in triads, minor and major. Try and keep them pretty far apart, but most importantly, have the trumpets work as a section with a brass. So the distance between the lowest trumpet and the highest trombone is as close as possible, basically. Fletcher doesn't care. And he does, actually no, that's not true. He does care. And the problem is that sometimes in some of the charts I saw, he was writing them like pretty high, because you only have 5 parts. There were a couple times, there was one chart, I forget the name, but I'll try and attach it, where the score is literally written for 4 trumpets and 1 trombone. And that can't be what Fletcher initially intended. He just wrote the thing so high that the lead trombone part is too high to be played. It goes up to like numerous C's and probably D. And I think that's in concert, and like, no. He also writes in concert. Eddie Sauter kind of switched between writing his scores in concert, and this doesn't matter. But yeah, Fletcher did keep them together, and he would keep them as close as possible. Also, the voicings that he used with the trumpets, a lot of the time, like the 1st and the 2nd would be just a major second apart. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to keep them in like further apart, because, you know, like a major triad here sounds really good. So Fletcher didn't care, basically. The advantages of that is that it creates a more uniform sound. Not that I'm really seeing that, but when I listen to like the 1930s, or seeing that as a rule put down anywhere, but when I listen to like Benny Goodman's band with Ziggy Elman, Harry James, and Chris Griffin, you hear this unified trumpet sound one of the strongest trumpet sections ever. And if they're playing closer together, that kind of makes sense. You don't have like a really high off like lead trumpet part where the second part is, you know, not even in the same range and not going to sound well. And then like, you know, the lower 2 or 3 trumpets are just, you know, they're there. But by the time you get down to the fifth is playing like the notes that you almost learn in like, you know, the first 2 weeks of ever picking up a trumpet. And how are you going to make them sound like the same sound as, you know, 2 octaves up? That's kind of hard to do. So Fletcher's parts don't need to worry about that. It sounds like a really strong section, but it seems like the hardest part out of the brass is the first trombone part. I don't know if Fletcher intended that. Also, some of these arrangements that I'm thinking of and was looking at was like 34, 35. These might have been the scores that were given to Benny, you know, 35 or 36, but some of them might have been actually written initially, conceived by him before he joined Benny Goodman's entourage, and when Fletcher was still using his own band from 33. That. And then the saxes are kind of, in the way that Fletcher writes the saxes are kind of written the same way as like the standard, as you can think of it. So I talked about the trumpets. In terms of the trombones, trumpets and trombones. In terms of the standard way of writing saxes, sometimes in terms of like bassy stuff, if these are the trombones, these are the saxes, or these are the saxes, and then the melody could be one of the trumpets or something. That's a simple way of like copy and pasting, basically, kind of like strengthening it. Not necessarily playing their own notes, not necessarily, or certainly not playing any different rhythms at the same time when they're voiced. If you're playing 2 different sections at the same time, you're supposed to never voice both sections if they're playing at different rhythms. Fletcher breaks that. Jimmy Mundy, I've known for a long while, breaks that, which is why I keep wanting to write that way. But every single arranging teacher I've ever had tells me, no, you can't have multiple sections written, voiced at the same time, because too much information, the audience can't stand it. It's not clear, it's not concise. Well, I knew Jimmy Mundy, who's not as good of an arranger, you can argue, but he's the arranger for Sing 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 and so much the other like exciting Benny Goodman repertoire. He's done it in some of the most important pieces. Fletcher, I've seen proof of him doing exactly that. It was even at the beginning of 1 or 2 of the pieces that I looked at. He's voiced two, maybe 3. I think the trombones were doing something different as well. And this is technically what should be the standard of big band arranging from the very beginning. That's Fletcher Henderson. And the saxes, yeah. So the saxes, there's only 4 of them. But they're always playing different notes. That is another thing. Same with like the trumpets and trombones, you don't want them to have repeated notes. Technically with like one of the trumpets, when you're playing like a triad, and it's an important line, you could have it doubled by the trombones, but not repeated within the trumpets themselves. I mean, when you only have 3 trumpets, it's hard to double a note. That's a bad idea. And then with, so saxes, Fletcher will always write, if it's a major chord, major 6. If it's a minor chord, minor 6, or minor 7. There's always different notes for each of them. So that's basically that. Now, Eddie Sauter, and I should probably give you a few playing examples. So imagine and I've stopped this, and you're listening to it, and that's wonderful. Can't remember a specific playing example. I'll get into that in the description. Anyways, okay, now getting on to Eddie Sauter. What does he do? Basically everything I've said, he does a lot less than that and a whole lot more. He does the things that you shouldn't do in big band arranging, and he often starts with that, and then he gets more and more complicated to the point where he's basically playing Wayne Shorter or Wagner, at least in some of the more complicated things. I mean, he wrote so much for Benny, and I found a bunch of, I checked out so many charts, and some of them I have never heard recordings of. They're probably not as interesting. Maybe some of them weren't recorded, and that's not the point. I'll get to them eventually, but I haven't really looked at them yet. The songs I specifically picked for this assignment were Moonlight on the Ganges, which is a ridiculous chart that definitely shows who Eddie Sauter is. Love Walked In, which is a nice ballad, ish, like slow swing, medium swing. But the way he plays it is just so beautiful and so simple. I wanted to pick everything I love. I looked at that. It's a chart with Peggy Lee, I think from 1942. It's a chart with Peggy Lee that's really simple and really beautiful. And I kind of looked at that, but I didn't use it as much of an example as others. Eddie does some gorgeous arrangements for Peggy, which I haven't checked out as much of, but also for Helen Forrest, who's a very underrated singer, just one of those other white singers. When you hear about Billie Holiday playing with Artie Shaw, guess what? Helen Forrest was the white singer in that band who gets completely ignored, at least by history. And maybe she should be at that point, but by 1941, 1942, she is one of the biggest names in the music industry, who was then playing with Benny Goodman, and then Artie Shaw, and then Benny Goodman, and then chose to sing with Harry James. And there's a bunch of movies with very good footage of the two of them. Not necessarily amazing arrangements, because Harry James by that point is just playing like kitsch. I don't know. Ballads that sound beautiful and give Helen a lot of time to sing the verses. But her stuff with Eddie Sauter and Benny Goodman are so good. Anyways, and the way he writes over that, as much of it as I could check out, was like, yeah, really simple, really beautiful, in things that Fletcher would never write. And the other song I looked at was Superman, which is a feature for Cootie Williams. Technically, Moonlight on the Ganges also had Cootie, I believe, but that's besides the point. Superman was written for Cootie Williams. And yeah, so I checked out all of these. I recommend you check out all of those samples. I'll put examples in the description below, because there's a few different versions of them. Superman, when I looked at it, there's like a shortcut that's probably about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, and then there's an extended one that's 4.5 minutes. It's a fantastic chart. It goes through a lot of things, and I found out in the music, it was originally called Opus 1, but I suppose Cy Oliver beat him to that title. So some of the charts say Opus 1, and some of them say Opus 1 and scratched out Superman, like penned in. Like he didn't exactly have a title, and then he found it later. I bring that up because, like, the chart Superman, let's just talk about that one first, I guess. It's really interesting, and it goes to as many different sections as it can. Same with Benny Rides Again and Clarinet a la King, which are the main things you'd think of for Eddie Sauter writing for Benny Goodman. But I think I do have those charts, and I didn't look at them as much because everyone looks at those charts. So what did I write for Superman? There's a... First off, Superman and Moonlight on the Ganges both are written for 5 saxes, and what I'm interested in is the writing he does for 4 saxes. Is not as big of a deal, but there was no extra 5th part in both of them. One of them was missing a first tenor part, and the other was missing a second tenor part. And I think Moonlight on the Ganges was also missing the last page of the Barry part. But I put as much of it into Sibelius as I could. The interesting thing about Superman, listen to the 4.5 minute long version with Cootie Williams, and then get back to me, and then get back to this video. Okay. The interesting thing is that the recording completely scraps the beginning. The beginning is not all that interesting. It's like da-da, just the flat 6 to 5, da-da, da-da, bop, bop, like a bunch of different times for like 16 bars or something. That's how it's supposed to be set up. And then Cootie Williams starts, but the recording actually just starts when Cootie starts. It's supposed to be this epic piece, and it starts without even being voiced, and it just has like not even a pedal, it's just between the 5th and the 1, which gets to the point about how the differences with Eddie Sauter writing compared to Fletcher Henderson. He writes in triads. He doesn't think of like 4-part writing. He does write at 4-part at a bunch of different points, including a bunch of times in Superman. But tons of times he's just going to write in simple minor triads. Usually minor triads, not major. I'm not sure why the difference is, especially. And then he'll do other things with it. In terms of like a song that he's arranging, he will try to make it sound like it's not a 32-bar chorus followed by a 32-bar chorus. Fletcher does have very interesting interludes. He has interesting intros, but then he gets into the song and it's exactly what it is, and then it's exactly what it is in a different key, whatever it is. Eddie is trying to hide that, even if he does stick to exactly 32 bars. In terms of Superman, it's hard to tell because, or at least like as you're listening to it, because what is the melody, what isn't the melody? Immediately you hear these shots like really high up, and I'm not sure if it's a mistake. The clarinet is the highest part, which is like a B flat, and then the sax, the first alto, is the second highest up, and it's playing an A. So they're a semitone apart, and it's like it's not really a functional sound when you get down to it. I have something written here which might be a B flat, A, F, D, C, F, and D is technically what's being played at the time. But when you listen to the recording and when I listen to what I inputted on Sibelius afterwards, I don't know if it's supposed to be anything. It's like the alto should be in A flat instead of a... if the alto was in A flat, it would make more sense. It would be more like B flat 9. But it's not. So I don't know what it was. It just sounds jarring. There's a bunch of times that are just jarring melodies that have, or sounds that have nothing to do with anything else. Moonlight on the Ganges is even more so that. There's also a ton of different offbeat sections that he's writing. Throughout the, at least Moonlight on the Ganges and Superman. And he's writing as extreme dynamics as he possibly can when you actually look at the score. I don't remember ever seeing mezzo forte. There's tons of triple fortes and triple pianos, and sometimes they're going immediately between each other within the space of a bar. It's like the band is, like he assumes the band will discriminate against mezzo forte, like they're just going to completely ignore it, which is funny because that's what all big bands kind of do. Your standard playing is going to be like kind of a mezzo forte dynamic, and most big bands just ignore the dynamics, let's face it, because they want to play well, they want to be heard, and especially when the lead alto needs to be heard, sometimes it's going to be could play higher than the dynamic anyways, and then the rest of the sax section might say, oh, well, we're not playing that softly, okay, I'm going to play that high anyways. And then, the band is working too hard to balance with itself. But Sauter is extremely thorough about the dynamics, and so many crescendos, decrescendos, everything. But it's absurd, basically, when you actually like write it out exactly what he means. But it's an extreme, just for something to be heard, I think. There's also classical kind of like glissandos, appoggiaturas, or something in different parts, like for the saxes a lot of the time, and it's at weird beats. I think it's in Superman at different points. Like you see it not just with the lead alto, but the entire sax section. They do things that, like, okay, they're good studio musicians. Benny always had good studio musicians. He didn't always have his favorite musicians, but in the highlight of his career, for sure, they all had good classical chops. Maybe not great sax, like blues improv chops, but that's besides the point. So Eddie was also trying to break like the 32-bar phrase. You can hear it at a bunch of different points. He's just going into random interludes for a long length of time. Superman is a good example of that, where it gets into this long minor section. And when I'm just listening into the recording, it just sounds like it's in one key, like whatever it is. I'd love to have a playing example or piece of paper to show you, but I can't have access to a printer right now because that's at the school, which has been locked. Thank you. So you're just gonna have to hear things from me. But when you actually look at what he wrote, anyways, like da 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 is basically all diminished chords, and I can't really hear it. But when I actually listen, or when I actually check out the record or the score, you can see on the guitar part, which I don't really hear at all on the chart or in the recordings, just because of the the sound quality of the time. I'm assuming 1941, or around there for all these three recordings. It just gets drowned out, especially the piano as well in Moonlight on the Ganges at the beginning. I'll get to that in a sec. But yeah, a lot of it is like more complex harmonies than you think, but it's also very simple harmonies, but it's just going off of things that don't connect with what the horn parts are doing at that time, or that no one else is playing. Yeah, I'll talk about Moonlight on the Ganges as well. The very beginning of Moonlight on the Ganges, it's like with a bass clarinet. It's supposed to be a bass clarinet written, but it's actually a Barry sax on the recording, and Benny on the clarinet. They're playing this line together. The bass is actually playing a different line. It's between the two parts, but it's an even simpler line than that, which surprised me. Like, they don't even trust the bass player to play like offbeats within like just the 1 and the 5. Of course, the bass player at times was Benny's brother, so I hope they had a good family about that. But when you listen to the piano and the guitar part, which you can't really hear on the recording as well, what's happening is just minor triads. Not with that rhythm, but just a minor triad that starts on the E flat. It's an E flat minor triad, even though the bass clarinet and clarinet are supposed to be playing D and A. D, A, D, D, A, D, but it starts with the E flat, G flat, and B flat, which then goes to E minor, which then goes to F minor, and it keeps going up and up and up until the trumpets start, and it sounds like the trumpets, which are also playing these minor triads, just those minor triads. The trumpets start going down. It sounds like just something else that's added, but that actually is the beginning of the piece. Check out the Frank Sinatra version of Moonlight on the Ganges, now that I'm getting into it. Because it's a beautiful tune that I guess no one really knows. Don't listen to the beginning of the Frank Sinatra version, though, which just sounds weird and exotic for no reason. But when he comes in, Moonlight on the Ganges, the trumpets are playing that. And you might not immediately hear it because it doesn't set up. It's just like these triads are slowly coming up. Then the trumpets come in kind of shyly in these minor triads. So immediately Sauter is taking things, instead of, weird exotic, like the way that Duke Ellington did in the really early 30s, and the way basically everyone took exotic music from the 30s. Sauter ends up taking it this Wagner kind of direction. The beginning almost sounds more like Wayne Shorter in terms of like, bass, or like a simple triad under a bass that has absolutely no necessary significance. But the way he sets it up, right before they get to, I think, bar 5, whenever they get to the G, the 4, right before then, if you look at all the notes, it's technically D7 altered. If you take the A out, because the bass line is technically doing like the D, A, D, D, A, D, the A is not played on the beat 4 though. So you actually put all the notes together. I don't think Eddie was actually thinking that way. It's just what works foundationally. But it's a perfect 5-1 into the 4. After all this craziness that keeps like going, just adding tension. Also at a different point in the piece where it goes absolute craziness, after the melody basically, before the first solo, it gets into, I'm trying to remember offhand, the bass is playing double stops for one. Bass is playing E and B. So the low note is E. The chord is G flat, add 2, G flat, not, I guess 9, G flat 9 because of the E, G flat 9 over E. But then the clarinet and it might be the Barry again, are doing C, F sharp, G, Z, G, F sharp, D, C, da 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 da. And it makes almost no sense. I mean, the way you're hearing it, you can hear the chord or what the clarinet and Barry, I guess, are playing. It has no significance to the actual chord, and then you have like the double stops at the bottom, which also have no significance. Well, almost no significance. It can be the 7th, but if it's the 7th, then why is the 4th of the G flat 7 there? And it sounds messed up, and it sounds super cool. And then immediately goes into the trumpet solo. The backgrounds for the saxes, though, are written as if it's Fletcher. Not exactly as if it's Fletcher, but still in an interesting way. Okay. And it keeps going, and it's really cool. I think I'm at the 31-minute mark, and including like a bunch of music. Maybe I'm talking too long. Okay, but I'll get into the other song, the last of the 3 songs I mentioned, which was Love Walked In. Love Walked In is a really interesting piece because it's all, I like to say Debussy, in terms of like what the clarinet is playing. It's like so the clarinet Benny is doing some interesting things in lines which are specifically written out. A bunch of the time Eddie did write out exactly what the soloist was supposed to do. Fletcher did too. The way Fletcher would write solos was like just writing the melody most of the time, whatever it was. He wouldn't give you the chord changes, he would just have the melody there, and I might say solo, and that's it. Which kind of explains how on so many of the Fletcher Henderson recordings, like the soloist basically just sticks to the melody, because that's exactly what's written on the part, as if that's all Fletcher wants you to play. But he would write some specific things like leading into the next section, just like the bar or two beforehand. Those things would be, some of the time. Not necessarily the coolest parts that Harry James would come up with in his solos, like right before or in interludes with the band. That is experience and good playing. Same with Benny for a little bit, but I just love Harry's stuff. Anyways, yeah, what Eddie does with Love Walked In is really interesting there, like right from the beginning. Lots of, it's not shake, slide. I think it was wrote slide or squeeze. So many times he writes squeeze for the brass. But so much of that piece, the saxes are playing, you know, pads, but like da da da, like they're insistent, but it's not it's not the way Fletcher would write backgrounds. Simpler. I don't want to say more expected, but at the same time like stronger, just at the beginning, and then immediately dies out. Fletcher doesn't necessarily do. Fletcher has a very specific style, and he always sticks to that. And you can also check out his version of In the Mood in 1939, in terms of like his examples of writing. In the Mood might not be everyone's favorite piece of music, but Benny, like every time like a new song came out by any band, all the other big bands would want to like get their own version of it. Same with today, right? The next like Katy Perry or Beyonce tune that comes out and is a worldwide hit, all these party bands are immediately going to try and cover it. So bands back then did that as well. And Benny, when In the Mood came out, he asked Fletcher Henderson to write an arrangement for it. And it sounds like a Fletcher Henderson chart, but it also sounds so much worse than the Jerry Gray version of In the Mood, because it's just not that interesting. It's like Fletcher sticks towards a very specific way of writing, and that's it. That's his box, and it sounds so good, and Benny loves it. And Benny doesn't really like the Eddie Sauter stuff, at least not in 1939, according to Toots Modello, who was the lead alto player at the time, from some interview, never mind that. But Fletcher like sticks to that, and Eddie goes smaller and so much more, in terms of like the crazy harmonies I was just describing, or trying to describe some of it. But yeah, a lot of Love Walked In as well, on top of that. On top of like cool clarinet lines and glisses and stuff. It's just duos. A lot of the time it's just duos. Also, a piece that I didn't really look at, Ramona, which is another Eddie Sauter piece. It's almost like a mariachi trumpet section at different points. But what I didn't realize is listening to it the first time, it's a solo trumpet line that then becomes a duo trumpet line that then becomes a three-part trumpet line. Which also reminds me, in terms of the trumpets, a lot of the time in big band writing, you were never supposed to write the trumpets alone. Never write the trumpets without the trombones. The trombones can be playing a pad underneath, and then the trumpets can play on top of it. That's okay, but never just play with the trumpets. Looking at all this music, a couple things were confirmed. One, the reason for doubting that, for me, was always Swing Time in the Rockies, that this transcription, I think David Berger did from the Carnegie Hall concert in 1938, which I bought a long while ago. It had a trumpet solo that didn't have the trombone, so I figured, okay, Jimmy Mundy writes like that. I've now seen what Jimmy Mundy wrote, and he actually wrote it also for the trombones. Now the trombones couldn't play, or for that live concert, or they did, and they just weren't heard and weren't transcribed. When you listen to the original recorded version, not the live version, you do hear the trombones. So we did write it for them. However, all the same, Eddie Sauter wrote just the trumpets alone a lot. He wrote a lot of duo parts, and he wrote the trombones alone a lot more than I ever thought Benny Goodman music would have them. And sometimes they would be a lot lower than I expected. I think I'm getting to the point where I should be wrapping this up, and I haven't talked about the piece that I wrote yet. So, let's forget all of that. Oh, yeah. So Sauter wrote like trios and duos a lot of the time, and sometimes it would be mixed between the sections a whole lot more than what Fletcher would ever write. And he would write the rhythmic four-part lines, but they would usually be shorter, and they would be building towards something else. And basically all of his pieces, as beautiful as they are, they'd usually start with, just triads, and then they would get thicker and thicker and thicker. Maybe the exception is Moonlight on the Ganges, which does start with triads, but it's played over like the bass pedal, and that keeps moving, but that doesn't, which creates craziness. If you can hear it, which you can't exactly. But when you listen to the Sibelius version, it's a little bit different. Anyways, so from all this, I was trying to write a composition based off of Eddie Sauter, like the way Eddie Sauter would write. And it was supposed to be an original composition, and I decided not to actually write an original song for it. I wanted to pick a song that kind of sounded like these other three songs. I mean, Superman doesn't really sound like anything. It kind of sounds like a riff-based thing that Eddie just went crazy on. But Moonlight on the Ganges is a beautiful thing that's basically a ballad. Love Walked In could almost be a ballad. I decided to pick Nancy with a Laughing Face, which as a musician, I know lots of songs, but I don't actually know that one. I've always wanted to. So it was a good one to delve into myself, but it also has a bunch of chromatic. What is it? Da da ba da. Each time I see her, there's lots of chromatic things, and then da da, going down to the 7, which is actually diminished chord. So again, I went off of the Frank Sinatra version of this. He did two different versions. I think one was from 1945. So technically, if I'm trying to make a piece that sounds like 1941, I'm not actually sure Nancy with that Laughing Face would have counted as being an option for Eddie Sauter to write in if it wasn't composed by then. But let's assume that's fine. I wrote an arrangement, which I think pays better tribute to Eddie Sauter than me worrying about an original composition that kind of sounds like what he would have written. The thing about him that I love most is his arranging and what he can do. And some of his songs, his original songs, because he did write a bunch of originals for Benny, were very simple. But the point of them wasn't the song itself, it was where he took them. So I took Nancy with the Laughing Face, which is a beautiful ballad. Listen to the 1945 version by Frank Sinatra, not the later one. The later one's okay, but the initial one. I went double time with it, and I turned it into a minor song, because also Eddie, some of my favorite versions of his music is minor. And I also wanted to take some of the things I took from that Eddie did with Love Walked In, and some of the other ballads that he did. and find a way of utilizing that in a medium swing tune. So pick a ballad and make it like a medium or up swing. So what I added to this piece, I started basically the same way as Moonlight on the Ganges, except instead of like the triads ascending, they're descending, which is actually less interesting, and it makes it sound more like a musical. That's my own criticism of myself. I don't really like it as much, but that's okay. And a lot of the time I kept the lines, like the actual arrangement, much simpler than I would have wanted to write. Kept it in triads, even though I could have added like the six or whatever. Just not flesh it out and try and make it sound beautiful for itself. A bunch of the times through the melody, through the initial melody anyways, I had a bunch of duos. Benny's playing with the alto at some point, which is exactly what Eddie does in Love Walked In at one point. Trombones are playing duo a bunch. I think the trumpets might have a duo, and then the trumpets have like a trio. There's a bunch of times the trumpets aren't voiced with the trombones. There's one point I think the trombones are playing a trio part with just one of the tenors. And I'm also writing it specifically for Cootie Williams on the third trumpet chair, and Georgie Auld. I think I technically put him on the second tenor chair, but he's probably the first tenor. But ignore that little detail, it's fine. No one cares. They probably change parts anyways. And I also, in this recording, because thank you COVID, there's no way of actually recording this right now, so I'm just giving you the Sibelius file, which is a MIDI file, which is really bad. I just picked up a 30-day trial of Note Performer to try and help with the sound of it, and it makes it sound worse. You have never heard a worse clarinet sound than, like, you know, it's got good resonance, maybe, but like, just no. So I'd rather listen to the worst version, is what I'm saying, than listen to like a good quality MIDI version. And that's all you get. Happy COVID day. Where was I? Yeah, but because of that, I wrote in all of the solos. So I just wrote an imitation Cootie Williams solo, an imitation Georgie Auld solo, and imitated Benny's solo. Some of which doesn't sound as interesting as they probably would play themselves. But some of it also I would have written into the part anyways. Some of the stuff that I saw with, let's say, Superman, which is a feature for Eddie Sauter, a bunch of it was specifically written for Cootie Williams, exactly how he's supposed to play. When they get into the halftime part at the end, which I also do with this one, with Nancy, all of that was written out in the Eddie Sauter part for Superman, except at the very end is the original part, and what Cootie Williams does, he like glisses right up to the high tonic. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So I did that. I took the into Superman. Also, the part in Superman, which just goes into a long minor section, because I made most of this piece of Nancy, which is a major piece, except for the bridge. Basically, I made the entire piece, Nancy with a Laughing Face, more about the bridge, the minor part, than the major part. And the trumpet has a solo immediately after the melody, which is basically all but one chorus is in minor, instead of 3 choruses in major and 1 in minor or something like that. I switched the A sections up, and then I kind of inverted it for the clarinet part. The first A section is minor, and then the second one is major. And then the bridge, I think, is Georgie Auld's solo. Something like that. So criticism about my own piece. I don't really like the minor part, but then again, like it goes into Cootie just riffing off of like a minor chord, which is also not just a minor chord, it's every single diminished chord off of whatever the bass line is playing. Because that's what Eddie wrote. I'm imitating it a little too much. I'm imitating it without as much intention, I suppose. So I didn't like that as much, but I tried. And then I got a bit of that into Benny when Benny starts playing again after the Cootie Williams solo, which you'll hear. It sounds a little, the backgrounds I think sound a little bit too much like Artie Shaw's like call and response with the band, as opposed to the way Eddie Sauter wrote, which is more like Clarinet a la King. Not that I studied it, but I've just listened to it so many times. Where Benny's playing a line, but then two different sections in the band are responding to it. You know, so it's not just a call and response, it's a call, response, 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 response. Eddie was much better at that. And yeah, I've tried to work that and rework that, and I'm still not the happiest with it. And also the minor sections, I think I wrote as being diminished sections, but they really should be minor sections. Same with like Sing Sing Sing, not that that's a piece, but kind of, or by Eddie Sauter, it's by Jimmy Mundy. But the piece is written in minor, and the way Benny plays off of it, is more diminished. And same with the Superman part. I mean, the way Cootie Williams plays off of that minor part in Superman is just with the bucket mute. Bucket? Plunger. The plunger mute. So much. You know, he does the Cootie Williams over it. But it's, yeah. Like, in that era, it's more of a flat 5 than otherwise. But I just wrote it basically as diminished, even though it probably shouldn't be written like that initially. But that's okay, I guess. Yeah. So overall impressions for everything else that I did. I learned a lot. I played or wrote more simply than I thought I needed to, and I did as much section work as I could, and then expanded it more near the end. The hardest part was trying to build towards an important part that still gets like multiple sections playing at the same time going into it, because the more I looked at Eddie's music, the better he does of that every time. And you don't realize it, but writing that way is really cool, and it's so exciting when you do it well. But I would love to go back and do a bit of it, more of it, and I've just ran out of time. Anyways, those are basically all my ideas on Eddie Sauter right now. I hope you enjoy. I'm sorry for the quality of this video and of the actual song, which I'll put in a different video just to save time. Thanks for listening, and enjoy everything else on the internet until we're allowed to go outside again. Happy U of T.